Late May 1940. Over 300,000 British and Allied troops are pinned against the beaches of Dunkirk. With advancing panzer divisions closing in, they face total annihilation. Popular legend insists these men were saved by a spontaneous miracle of civilian little ships. But historical records reveal a very different reality. A massive, calculated extraction orchestrated by the Royal Navy under extreme duress. By all conventional military metrics, this stranded, defeated army should have been wiped out, forcing London to capitulate. So why did an absolute military catastrophe, where an entire army fled without its weapons, not result in immediate political surrender? The popular memory of 1940 relies heavily on the romantic image of a defiant island standing alone, shielded by civilian bravery and a stiff upper lip. But courage alone does not stop armored divisions or systemic aerial bombardment. The true survival of Britain was engineered not through sentiment, but through rigid logistics, brutal naval sacrifices, and the rapid, total mobilization of the state's industrial machinery. To understand the failure of the German offensive, we must strip away decades of post-war mythology. The reality was a cold, mechanized struggle, where a catastrophic defeat on the continent was aggressively transformed into an impenetrable industrialized fortress. It was a victory of complex institutions, shadow intelligence networks, and raw manufacturing power, operating at the absolute limit to thwart the German war machine. The paradox is profound. How exactly does a shattered military force, arriving home completely stripped of its heavy armour, transport and artillery, manage to rapidly construct an integrated, multi-layered defence network in the narrow window before the enemy can organise a cross-channel invasion? By late May, the British Expeditionary Force was no longer a modern mechanised army. The blistering pace of the German advance through the Low Countries and northern France had forced a chaotic, fighting retreat that collapsed the Allied lines inward. To move fast enough to avoid total encirclement, the British command had been forced into a brutal logistical calculation: abandon the heavy gear. Over 2,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 vehicles, and virtually all of their tanks were left rusting in the French countryside or sabotaged along the roads leading to the coast. The men who finally reached the beaches of Dunkirk and its surrounding dunes were stripped down to their rifles, steel helmets, and whatever ammunition they could carry in their webbing. They were isolated, exhausted, and fundamentally defenseless against a concentrated armored assault. The geography of Dunkirk offered no natural fortress. The shallow, gently sloping beaches forced men to wade out into the freezing surf, sometimes up to their necks, forming miles-long human piers while waiting for shallow draft vessels to ferry them to deeper water. They were entirely exposed, sitting ducks on an open expanse of sand. Time was no longer measured in days, but in agonizing hours. Above them, the Luftwaffe operated with near impunity, dominating the airspace. Stuka dive bombers and twin-engine medium bombers initiated a systematic, relentless pounding of the harbor facilities, the town, and the dense troop concentrations huddled on the beaches. Simultaneously, forward elements of German artillery batteries were aggressively moving into position along the coast, steadily zeroing their high-explosive shells on the shrinking British perimeter. The soft sand offered little to no cover against the jagged shrapnel raining down around them. London faced a dual, intersecting crisis of paralyzing complexity. The first was the immediate physical extraction. The English Channel is a notoriously volatile stretch of water, now further complicated by dense, shifting minefields laid by both sides. The vessels dispatched to retrieve the troops had to navigate these treacherous, narrow corridors while operating as prime, highly concentrated targets for relentless aerial bombardment. The second crisis was strategic and existential. Across that narrow strip of water, the British mainland defenses were virtually non-existent. The regular army was entirely trapped on the beach. The hundreds of thousands of men waiting on the sand represented the absolute core of Britain's trained, veteran military personnel alongside seasoned French divisions. If this force were annihilated or captured, any subsequent German amphibious landing on the southern coast of England would meet practically no organized, professional resistance. The survival of the nation depended entirely on getting these specific men across 21 miles of hostile water. The sheer mathematics of the extraction were terrifying. Moving over 300,000 men under direct enemy fire required an unprecedented synchronization of naval assets. Ships had to maneuver alongside the damaged eastern mole, a narrow breakwater constructed of stone and wooden piles, never designed for docking heavy military vessels under combat conditions. They had to load thousands of desperate troops while actively being bombed, navigate back across the channel through tightly swept, mine-cleared lanes, unload in England, and immediately turn around to do it again. It was an exhausting, agonizing cycle of vulnerability. Every vessel sunk not only killed the men aboard, but created dangerous navigational hazards in the shallow approach routes, threatening to choke off the entire operation. But this intricate naval ballet required one fundamental resource that the Royal Navy could not manufacture: time. The beaches had to remain accessible. The artillery fire had to be kept at a distance. The shrinking pocket around Dunkirk was not a static line. It was a collapsing perimeter under intense, multi-directional pressure from highly organized German infantry and mechanized units. To pull the main body of the army off the sand, that perimeter had to hold, minute by minute, hour by hour. It demanded an immediate, desperate fusion of strict naval logistics and immense Allied sacrifice. Someone had to stand between the exposed beaches and the advancing German vanguard. Someone had to bleed in the ruined towns and flooded fields of the French interior, fighting a doomed rearguard action, knowing perfectly well that holding the line meant they themselves would never see the rescue ships. The German advance should have been the end. On May 24th, the Panzer divisions were within striking distance, poised to crush the perimeter. Then the silence fell. The halt order, Hitler's direct command, stopped the German armor in its tracks. It remains one of the most debated decisions of the war, a confluence of tactical caution and the Luftwaffe's insistence that Goering's airmen alone could seal the pocket. It wasn't a miracle that gave the British those 48 hours. It was the catastrophic friction within the Nazi command structure. While the panzers waited, the extraction shifted from improvisation to brutal, professional necessity. The mythology of Dunkirk anchors itself in the image of brave civilian pleasure craft, but the ledger of history records a starkly different story. The bulk of the evacuation was conducted by the Royal Navy under a deluge of high explosive. Destroyers like HMS Grenade and HMS Basilisk became the true conduits of the operation. They pressed alongside the East Mole, a fragile, narrow stone breakwater, turning themselves into static targets for screaming Stukas. They took catastrophic losses, but they moved men in divisions, not dozens. Yet the Mole would have been a slaughterhouse without the desperate stand at Lille. The French First Army fought a battle that was mathematically lost from the first shell. They pinned down the German armoured spearheads that were intended to bypass the city and secure the coast. It was a cold, calculated bloodbath. They fought to the last round, knowing their own chance for rescue had long since passed, effectively buying the British military the critical minutes required to get the remaining divisions onto the decks. By June 4th, the operations ceased. 338,000 men stood on English soil, but the scale of the loss defied comprehension. They were not an army, they were a collection of ghosts. Every tank, every field gun, every vehicle, the entire technical apparatus of Britain's Continental Force had been left behind in the mud. As these survivors marched into the countryside, the reality hit home with chilling precision. The men were safe, but the nation was utterly hollow. If a mechanized invasion force crossed the Channel tomorrow, these veterans, brave as they were, had nothing to hold back the tide but their bare hands and empty rifles. How does a nation rebuild a wall when its foundation has effectively vanished? The immediate answer was found in the brutal arithmetic of the War Office ledgers. By the second week of June 1940, the inventory of the British Army was an open secret among the High Command, and it was terrifying. Across the entirety of the United Kingdom, there were fewer than 500 field guns, a fraction of the anti-tank weapons required to repel a mechanized assault, and fewer than 200 operational tanks. The beaches of France had consumed the modern British military. If the German Wehrmacht managed to secure a beachhead on the southern coast of England, they would be facing a defense composed of scattered regular units, hastily armed civilian volunteers, and World War I surplus rifles. The defense of the realm could no longer be fought on the beaches. It had to be fought in the skies over the Channel. But to fight an air war, a nation requires an industrial machine capable of replacing horrific losses in real time. Enter Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, a ruthless newspaper magnate appointed by Winston Churchill to head the newly created Ministry of Aircraft Production. Beaverbrook was not a military man, nor was he a polite bureaucrat. He was an industrial pirate, and he was exactly what the crisis demanded. Recognizing that the immediate survival of the nation rested entirely on the shoulders of Fighter Command, Beaverbrook initiated a draconian cannibalization of the British economy. He stripped aluminum, steel, and skilled labor from every other manufacturing sector. He overrode the entrenched, slow-moving bureaucracy of the Air Ministry, bypassing standard procurement protocols to deal directly with factory managers. If a plant was manufacturing passenger vehicles, heavy bombers, or commercial goods, Beaverbrook tore up their contracts and retooled them overnight to produce parts for the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. He demanded 24-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Women poured into the foundries and assembly lines, riveting duralumin skin onto wings and fitting massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engines into fuselages. The production graphs spiked dramatically, but manufacturing airframes was only half the equation. A fighter aircraft is a highly specialized, fragile machine with a devastatingly short operational window. In 1940, a Spitfire had enough fuel to remain airborne for roughly 90 minutes. If the Royal Air Force attempted to defend the island by keeping continuous patrols in the air, flying blind, waiting to spot incoming German bombers, they would burn through their fuel, exhaust their engines, and cripple their pilots within weeks, all without firing a single shot. The commander of RAF Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, understood that air supremacy was not merely a matter of having fast planes. It was a matter of information management. Dowding had spent the late 1930s fighting for funds to build something that had never existed before: the first fully integrated, centralized air defense network in the history of warfare. Along the southern and eastern coasts of Britain stood a line of towering 350-foot steel masts. This was Chain Home, a network of early warning radar stations broadcasting raw radio pulses out over the English Channel. When those invisible waves struck a mass of German metal forming over France, they bounced back, appearing as glowing green spikes on a cathode ray oscilloscope in a darkened concrete bunker. But raw radar was chaotic and prone to misinterpretation. Dowding's true genius was not the radar itself, but what happened to the data. When a radar operator detected an incoming raid, they picked up a direct, dedicated telephone line to the filter room at Fighter Command headquarters, hidden within a grand estate called Bentley Priory. Here, the raw coordinates, estimated altitudes, and aircraft numbers were instantly cross-referenced with reports from the Royal Observer Corps, thousands of civilians stationed across the countryside with binoculars, tracking the aircraft once they crossed the coastline, where the outward-facing radar was effectively blind. Inside the operations rooms, personnel of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force used long wooden rakes to push colored blocks across massive map tables, providing a real-time, three-dimensional picture of the airspace over southern England. This was the Dowding system. It eliminated the lethal guesswork of aerial warfare. Sector commanders looking down at those map tables could see the German formations organizing over France, calculate their trajectory, and wait until the absolute last minute to scramble their squadrons. Instead of flying exhausted patrols, British pilots sat in deck chairs on the grass next to their aircraft. When the telephone rang, they knew exactly what compass heading to fly and what altitude to climb to. They were not blindly hunting for the enemy. They were being precisely vectored to an intersection in the sky. Across the Channel, the atmosphere within the German High Command was a mixture of triumph and genuine bewilderment. By July 1940, France had fallen in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been chased off the continent. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler fully expected the British government to recognize the mathematical impossibility of their situation and seek a negotiated peace. From a traditional military perspective, continuing a war without a functioning army was illogical. When Churchill's government responded with defiance rather than diplomats, the mood in the Reich Chancellery shifted from confusion to intense irritation. Hitler issued Directive No. 16, ordering the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of Great Britain. But the German military apparatus was suddenly paralyzed by inter-service anxiety. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had been badly mauled during the invasion of Norway and possessed only a handful of operational destroyers. Admiral Erich Raeder bluntly informed Hitler that sending flat-bottomed river barges full of infantry across the English Channel while the Royal Navy still existed was tantamount to mass suicide. The Navy demanded absolute air supremacy. The skies over the Channel had to be cleared of British aircraft so the Luftwaffe could protect the invasion fleet and sink the British warships. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant and deeply arrogant commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that this would not be a problem. Göring possessed 3 massive air fleets arrayed in an arc from Norway down through Holland, Belgium, and northern France. He commanded thousands of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, twin-engine Bf-110s, and immense fleets of Heinkel, Dornier, and Junkers bombers. Göring calculated it would take roughly 4 days to smash Fighter Command's bases south of London, and perhaps 4 weeks to eradicate the Royal Air Force entirely. This supreme confidence was underpinned by a catastrophic failure of intelligence. Major Joseph Schmidt, the Luftwaffe's chief intelligence officer, produced a deeply flawed assessment of British capabilities. He concluded that the RAF was inflexible, poorly commanded, and tied to rigid, localized defense zones. More critically, German intelligence dismissed the towering chain-home masts on the coast. They knew the British were experimenting with radio direction finding, but they assumed it was a localized novelty, a primitive tool for individual anti-aircraft batteries. They had absolutely no conception that the radar was linked by miles of underground telephone cables to a centralized nervous system that could see their every move before their aircraft even crossed the water. In mid-August, Göring launched Adlertag, Eagle Day, the massive aerial offensive intended to break the back of the RAF. Heavily loaded German bombers droned across the Channel in massive stepped formations, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt fighters. As they crossed the French coast, the German crews expected to achieve total tactical surprise, catching British aircraft on the ground or ambushing isolated, disorganized patrols. Instead, as the Luftwaffe formations approached the English coast, they looked up into the glaring sun and saw something that shattered their confidence. Tight formations of Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires were already there, waiting for them at a higher altitude, perfectly positioned to dive. The shock in the German cockpits was profound. No matter where they crossed the coast, no matter what deceptive maneuvers they attempted, the British were waiting. The Luftwaffe was striking at a phantom. They believed they were fighting individual, localized fighter squadrons operating blindly. They failed to realize they were fighting a synchronized, continental-scale machine. But institutional brilliance does not make men bulletproof. As August dragged into September, the sheer, crushing weight of the German numerical advantage began to fracture the British defense. Frustrated by the constant interceptions, the Luftwaffe shifted its strategy. They stopped hunting fighters in the open sky and began systematically targeting the RAF sector stations, the vital airfields like Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch that served as the nerve centers for the defending squadrons. The bombardment of these airfields was devastating. Concrete runways were reduced to overlapping craters. Hangars were incinerated. Crucial telephone cables linking the operations rooms to the radar network were severed, forcing ground crews to scramble in the open under heavy strafing fire to splice the lines back together. Maintenance crews worked frantically to patch bullet-riddled airframes and refuel fighters, while high-explosive bombs literally detonated across the perimeter. The Dowding system was a technological marvel, and Beaverbrook's factories were miraculously delivering replacement aircraft faster than they were being destroyed. But machines do not fight wars. Flesh and blood do, and the Royal Air Force was bleeding dry. There was no factory that could manufacture a veteran combat pilot. The intense attrition meant that seasoned squadron leaders were being killed or severely burned, replaced by pale, terrified young men with barely 20 hours of flight time in a high-performance aircraft. Veterans were flying 3, 4, sometimes 5 combat sorties in a single day. They were landing with bloodshot eyes, hands shaking so violently they could barely light a cigarette, only to be rearmed and sent back up into the meat grinder within 20 minutes. The protective shield over the island was cracking. Fighter Command was starving for sleep, starving for experienced men, and slowly losing the operational capacity of its forward airfields. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe commanders sensed the exhaustion. They knew the British defense was fraying at the edges. Goering gathered his massive air fleets for one final, overwhelming hammer blow, absolutely certain that the island's defenses were on the verge of total, irreversible collapse, entirely unaware that the British possessed a weapon they could not see. That hidden weapon was operating in absolute secrecy 50 miles northwest of London, at a sprawling Victorian estate called Bletchley Park. While the Dowding system tracked German bombers once they were airborne, a shadow network of mathematicians and cryptanalysts was reading the Luftwaffe's mail before the engines even started. By successfully cracking the German Enigma ciphers, a program classified under the code word Ultra, British intelligence actively intercepted Goering's daily tactical directives. This decrypted foresight allowed Fighter Command to husband its desperately thin reserves. Instead of throwing everything into a chaotic defense, Dowding could surgically allocate his exhausted squadrons, placing them exactly where they were needed, and keeping just enough fighters on the ground to survive the next wave. This cold, systematic triage extended far beyond the airfields. Post-war memory heavily romanticizes the cheerful civilian standing defiant in the rubble, but spontaneous stoicism alone does not sustain a besieged wartime economy. The British government instituted a level of domestic mobilization that bordered on the totalitarian. Parliament rapidly passed emergency powers that stripped citizens of basic peacetime liberties. Strict, universal rationing dictated exact caloric intakes. Men and women were legally conscripted not just into uniform, but into foundries, agriculture, and relentless civil defense duties. Britain was ultimately held together by draconian institutional control, transforming a traditional democracy into a rigidly managed, highly surveilled fortress. The German High Command fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the state they were trying to break. Looking across the Channel, they still believed they were fighting a soft, demoralized nation teetering on the edge of political collapse. Completely blind to the Enigma intercepts and utterly dismissive of British administrative efficiency, German intelligence calculated that Fighter Command was functionally destroyed. Convinced the Royal Air Force was down to its very last reserves, Berlin finalized preparations for the decisive stroke, a massive, concentrated daytime knockout blow meant to finally force the stubborn island to its knees. That knockout blow was unleashed on Sunday, September 15th, 1940. Convinced by their own flawed intelligence that the Royal Air Force was a shattered remnant, the Luftwaffe launched its maximum effort. Massive formations of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, heavily shielded by hundreds of Messerschmitt escorts, blackened the skies over the French coast and began their methodical advance across the English Channel. The German air crews had been assured they would face only token resistance. They expected to fly over a defeated nation and pound London into final submission. Instead, they flew directly into a perfectly synchronized, multi-layered trap. Before the German engines had even reached optimal cruising altitude, the invisible machinery of the British state was already reacting. At Bletchley Park, intercepted Enigma traffic confirmed the sheer scale and trajectory of the assault. Along the coast, the chain-home radar network tracked the massive blips with chilling precision. Inside the underground bunker at Bentley Priory, the filter room processed the data flawlessly, sliding colored markers across the map tables without a single wasted second. Because the intelligence was absolute, the response was mathematically devastating. British sector commanders didn't panic, and they didn't waste fuel on frantic, blind patrols. They waited, husbanding their reserves, and then vectored their fighters to intercept at the exact moment of maximum tactical advantage. When the German bomber crews looked out through their plexiglass canopies over Kent and Sussex, their confidence evaporated. The skies were not empty. Waiting for them were wave after wave of fully fueled, heavily armed Spitfires and Hurricanes. Thanks to Beaverbrook's ruthless industrial mobilization, there was no shortage of replacement airframes. Thanks to Dowding's centralized radar network, every single fighter was perfectly positioned. The airspace south of London instantly transformed into a sprawling, multi-tiered mechanical meat grinder. The centralized British command system operated under extreme pressure without fracturing. As soon as one RAF squadron expended its ammunition and dove away, another fresh squadron was vectored in to take its place. The German formations were systematically shredded, forced to drop their payloads blindly into the countryside as their aircraft were torn apart by concentrated machine gun fire. The Luftwaffe absorbed completely unsustainable losses in both machines and irreplaceable veteran air crews. By the time the sun set over the English coast that evening, the skies finally fell quiet, leaving the German High Command to face a paralyzing reality. The momentum of the seemingly invincible German air offensive had not just been stalled. In a single, brutal afternoon, it had been decisively and permanently broken. The broken German offensive over the skies of southern England was not just a tactical defeat. It was the catastrophic collision of two entirely different doctrines of war. It forces us to look back across the Channel to the bloody sands of Dunkirk. The desperate naval extraction in late May was not the conclusion of a campaign, but the necessary down payment for the survival of the nation. By stripping the beaches of its trained human capital, leaving behind every piece of heavy equipment to save the men themselves, the British state bought the one resource it could not manufacture: time. They bought the weeks required for draconian factory mandates to churn out replacement aircraft, for cryptanalysts to map the enemy's mind, and for a centralized radar network to seamlessly weaponize the island's airspace. The failure of the Third Reich to secure a political capitulation immediately after Dunkirk exposed a fatal structural flaw in German operational planning. Berlin assumed that a shattered field army equated to a shattered nation. They fundamentally underestimated the terrifying resilience of a fully mobilized, institutionalized defense. The conflict was no longer about swift, armored spearheads drawing new borders on a map. It had morphed into a grinding, unforgiving war of absolute industrial attrition. The survival of Britain was not secured by the comforting, romantic myth of a plucky, lucky island standing alone with a stiff upper lip. It was secured because, in the shadow of absolute annihilation, a modern, ruthless, mechanized fortress state recognized exactly what was required to out-engineer the German war machine. In the end, Britain was not saved by a sudden miracle on the beaches, but by the relentless, invisible machinery of radar towers, repurposed factories, and encrypted intelligence. The defeated army that fled the continent, completely stripped of its weapons, survived just long enough to construct the very system that would eventually destroy its pursuers. The German military arrived at the Channel expecting a swift political surrender, only to find an unforgiving, industrialized fortress that would dictate the brutal terms of the rest of the war.